Hey, it's Art from my new microphone, and this one is for all of my Logic users out there. In this video, I'd like to discuss my top 11 stock plugins from Logic Pro X and why I love using them so much in my mixes. So in this video, we will be jumping between a production session where I'm working on producing a track myself and a mixing session where I'm mixing a track for somebody else to really get a sense of how I use these plugins not only in production, but also in mixing. So not to bury the lead, I will quickly list out my top 11 favorite stock Logic Pro plugins, and I'll also leave timestamps in the video description down below so that you can jump ahead to whatever plugin makes the most sense for you that you'd like to learn the most about. So my top 11 favorite stock plugins in Logic Pro are the Gain plugin, the Compressor, the Enveloper, the Channel EQ, the Tape Delay, the Stereo Delay, the Space Designer, the Distortion II, the Direction Mixer, the Pedalboard, and finally the De-Esser. We will go through them in this order in this video. Let's get this video started and hop right into Logic Pro. All right, here we are inside my digital audio workstation of choice, Logic Pro, to discuss my favorite stock Logic Pro plugins. It is storming like crazy outside. I don't know if the microphone is going to pick that up or not, but hopefully the power doesn't get turned off because trees are falling down and we can get through this video. So like I said, we will be working with a production session and a mixing session. So this is a production session right here for a track that I'm currently working on. And halfway through our discussion on the Gain plugin, which is number 1 on my list, I'll switch to a mixing session that I'm working on for another band. And then for every plugin that I'll be discussing, I'll hop between the production session and the mixing session, just to give you a better idea of how I use these plugins in production versus in mixing. So starting off with the Gain plugin, we have this one right here. Super simple, super effective. I use this on every one of my mixes, most notably for gain staging. So this isn't typical for me, but in this production session, I actually went through and gain staged all of my tracks here. So if I was to go here and disable all of these plugins across the board, you would see that everything is properly gain staged, and we will have levels at about -20 to -16 on all of these tracks. So let's have a quick listen here. So there is some fader movement that will bring those levels down, but if I had everything at unity, then this would be gain stage so that every track at unity would be around -20 to -18 dB. So that is one use that I have for the Gain plugin that I use on pretty much every one of my mixes. I really don't go without gain staging anymore. I used to, and I just found that it made for more work than is necessary. I realize gain staging is kind of a controversial thing here on YouTube in particular, but I've found great results from it, and I would definitely recommend you do it. I actually have a video on gain staging. I'll leave a link to that in the description box down below if you'd like to check that one out after this video. But that is a great use of the Gain plugin. Another use case for the Gain plugin here in Logic Pro is this phase invert. So this button allows us to flip the phase or invert the phase of a signal. This is a common practice when I get multi-tracks that have a top and bottom snare. The top snare will typically be out of phase with the bottom snare, and so I'll typically flip the phase of the bottom snare so that they are more aligned, and that way I can get a more cohesive sound in the snare or whatever other tracks there are. So in this particular case, these are all sampled drums right here. I haven't recorded live drums for this just yet, and so that's not super necessary. However, I will show you in the mixing session that I do use this phase invert on the gain, typically when I'm gain staging, to help better align the phase of the tracks that I'm working with. So I don't believe I need it at all in this particular production session. However, I do often use that in mixing, and it's just a great way to get a quick phase invert with this super easy to use Gain plugin. Now this right here is the mono version of the plugin. What I love about Logic is that all of its plugins will automatically switch from mono to stereo. So if I go right here into the snare 2 and I turn that into stereo, this will automatically turn into a stereo version of the plugin, which I love. I'll turn that back to mono for a second, mono as well, and go over to actually the mix bus right here and put a stereo gain plugin here. So right here we have our gain, which is typical. where we can increase or decrease the gain of a track. And you see here that we have phase invert on the left channel and the right channel. So in the stereo version of this plugin, we can flip the phase on either of these. This is a great way on the master bus to get a sense of the correlation between the left and the right. So if I play this back and invert one of these and it sounds better, then I know that I have severe issues in my phase correlation. However, if things thin out, particularly in the low end, then I know that my phase correlation is pretty good. So let's toggle this back real quick to have a listen. So you hear how it sounds a lot worse when one of these channels is inverted, which is what it should be when we are flipping the phase of one of these channels to test for correlation of phase between the left and right. Another thing we have here is the balance. So this is effectively an additional pan knob. So if we listen to the track, I can pan this all the way to the right or all the way to the left or anywhere in between. The stereo version of this plugin also allows me to swap the left and right. I will often use this when I'm dealing with a master delay or a master reverb. I believe I actually did this right here. Yeah, so right here I have on the master verb a stereo gain plugin, and I swapped the left and right channels. And what I'm doing here is I'm feeding this master verb with all of these orchestral instruments right here. You can see they are all bussed or sent to bus 18. And over here, we have our master verb with an input at bus 18. So essentially, I'm sending stereo information into this master verb channel and then processing it with reverb. So whatever is on the right, its reverb will be mirrored on the left, and whatever's on the left, its reverb will be mirrored on the right. Just an interesting way of adding a bit of extra depth and cohesion to these orchestral instruments, which I really wanted to have sound as if they were in the same spot. Now, this is not a finished mix, but I can kind of show you what that sounds like here. So things sound a little bit more gelled together when I have this swap left and right channel on, and they sound a little bit more separate when I have it off for reasons that I just mentioned. So let's close that one down and go back into the gain right here on the master channel. We'll see that I have a mono switch right here on the stereo version of this plugin. And I use this all the time on my mix bus or master bus to get a good sense of how my mix will translate to mono playback systems. So this is a super easy way of collapsing the mix to mono, and I use this on pretty much every one of my mix buses. So if we were to play this back, you will hear it in stereo when this is off, and then I can collapse it to mono to really hear how it sounds as if it was being played through a mono playback system. So let's have a listen. So a lot of the sides information in this production really disappears when I bring it to mono, and I would have some work to do here in the mix to really ensure that I have great mono compatibility in this particular song. And a final use case I have for the gain plugin is during revisions, or if I have automation on a fader, let's say, and I don't want to disturb that automation, I can put a gain plugin either on the track itself or on a subgroup that that track is feeding into to have more level control. So let's say I have a bunch of automation on a track and okay, that track is a little bit too loud. Rather than going in and adjusting all of the automation, I can just insert a gain plugin at the end of the insert chain right here and adjust the gain by a static, let's say 3 dB, and then hear what that track sounds like 3 dB less without getting rid of any of the automation. Of course, I can use VCAs for this same reason, but this is a super quick way to use the gain plugin to do so. And if it turns out that that's not the right move in the mix, I can just quickly bypass it and move on. This is great at the end of the chain, or if I need to drive any particular plugin with more or less level, I can put a gain plugin within this insert chain right here. Although typically I will level match as good as possible within my plugins, so I get proper gain staging to each successive plugin in the chain. So that is the gain plugin in this production session. Let us quickly move over to the mix session and talk about the gain plugin there. All right, and here we are inside of a mix session. You'll see here that this one's a bit more organized than the production session. I don't have any virtual instruments going and no MIDI information whatsoever. I'm only dealing with audio. And let's quickly have a look at how I'm using the gain plugin in this mix. So first off, what I would do is put a gain plugin on the stereo bus right here and be able to quickly compare the stereo mix to mono for mono compatibility. Let's have a quick listen to that.
Why do you take me in and then leave me on the ground? Grounded by the weight of your words and the sounds you make.
So we still lose a lot of that stereo information, obviously, when we are collapsing to mono, but I mix this in a way where we don't lose all of the information of the horns and the stereo effects when we sum down to mono. It's important for mono compatibility and overall mix translatability to do that. And this is a great quick tool for turning a stereo bus like the mix bus into a mono track right there. We can see somewhere in here that on the guitars, I actually adjusted the gain. This was for a mix revision. I actually brought the mix outside the studio, listened to it a few times, and found that the guitars were just a little bit too loud, so I brought them down 1.5 dB each with this gain plugin after all of the inserts on the channel, like was mentioned earlier. You can see that on all of the tracks, I have my gain plugin at the first insert, and this is for gain staging purposes. If I look at the snare bottom right here, we can see that I actually inverted the phase here on the SSL channel by waves by clicking this button, although I could not flip the phase on that and choose to invert it on the gain plugin as well, and we would have the same exact results. So that's how I use Logic's stock gain plugin. It is one of the most important plugins in my mixing arsenal. It's super simple to use, yet super effective for getting any results that I want. So before we move on, I just want to show you quickly, this is found under utility gain right here. And there is a mono and stereo version as we had just discussed. All right, the second stock plugin I love using from Logic Pro is the Compressor plugin. Now you may not assume this by looking at this session, as I'm using a lot of third-party plugins here like the Waves CLA 3A or the CLA 76 or the Bus Compressor. However, it is still a go-to. I'm just not using it in this particular mix. But let's say I wanted to swap this Bus Compressor with one of Logic's own. I would set that up. It comes in mono and stereo, just like all of Logic's plugins. And we have all of the typical controls here: threshold, ratio, makeup gain, release time, attack time, and knee. We can also adjust our input gain, our output gain, the mix for parallel processing. So we can have it at 0%, so only the dry signal comes through, at 100%, so only the compressed version of the signal comes through, or anywhere in between where we can blend the amount of dry and wet signal to effectively get parallel compression within this plugin. We have a distortion unit right here where we can have soft, hard, or clip style distortion or off. This compressor's soft distortion I use all the time just to give a little bit of added grit and saturation to the signal. And then we also have a limiter section right here where we can limit the signal in addition to the compression. We have sidechain control right here where we can detect either the max, the sum, the peak, or the RMS value of the sidechain. We also have a filter for the sidechain so we can control the frequency content of the sidechain signal that would trigger the compressor. So you see here we have a low pass, band pass, high pass filter, parametric EQ, and a high shelf, along with Q control to adjust the EQ curve of the sidechain signal. By default, the sidechain signal is coming in from the input signal. However, we also have a sidechain key right here where we can swap from the internal signal to any other signal, whether audio input, instrument, or bus, to act to control the sidechain of the compressor. So it's super powerful. You see here that I just turned off the Waves SSL bus compressor, and I actually have a version of that inside this compressor by Logic. It is the Vintage VCA. This is effectively an emulation of the SSL G-Bus 4000 bus compressor. And we have a bunch of other emulations up here too. So we have the Platinum Digital, which is the native digital compressor from Logic. We have Studio VCA, which is based on the Focusrite Red A. We have the Studio FET, which is the Yuri 1176 Revision E. classic VCA, which is the DBX 160, this vintage VCA, which I just stated was the SSL G-Bus 4000, the vintage FET, which is the Yuri 1176 revision H, and the vintage Opto, which is based on the Teletronics LA2A. Now, unlike the Waves compressors, the interface doesn't look anything like the original hardware units that these different algorithms aim to recreate. However, they do give us some added control and some versatility to get these different styles of compression. So a super powerful plugin. See that I'm not really using it in this mix. However, it is one that I regularly go to, especially as a quick way to get some compression in the production, which we will get to shortly. I will show you here, however, that I do use it almost exclusively as a sidechain compressor because it's so easy to quickly go in here to Dynamics, Compressor, open that up and just key it to whatever it needs keyed to. So in this case, the horn bus is being keyed to the lead vocal. So whenever the lead vocal sounds, the horn bus is brought down in level to allow that vocal to shine in the mix. We can have a quick listen to that. I will toggle this on and off.
Why do you take me in and then leave me on the ground? Surrounded by the weight of your words and the sounds you make when you lie.
So it's subtle, but it really helps duck the horns a little bit and allows those vocals to shine through a little bit more. So regardless of what other compressors I'm using, I'll typically reach for the SSL channel compressor right here with this dynamic section, the CLA76, the CLA3A, or the SSL bus comp all by Waves. However, when I am reaching for this, it's often for sidechain compression because it's just so easy to dial it in. And in the Platinum Digital, there's not really a whole lot of coloration that happens. I will sometimes add a bit of distortion right here, but that's generally how I use it in my mixes. And depending on the style of compression I want, I may very well go ahead and choose any of these other instances or algorithms that we have available to us in this super powerful stock plugin from Logic. Let's quickly hop over to the production session to talk about compression a little bit more. All right, we are back in the production session, and let's have a look at how I'm using compression in this particular session right here. So starting with the snare, you can see that I'm using the vintage FET option right here, which again emulates the Yuri 1176 revision H. And you'll see that I have a very slow attack and a fast release. So this allows the transient of the snare drum to poke through before the compressor clamps down and effectively enhances the punchiness of the snare. So let's have a quick listen right here in the context of the mix. I will turn this compressor on and off. Just helps thicken it up a little bit in the mix, and I really love this FET style of compression, even if only used subtly on snare drums. You would have noticed in the mix session that I was using the Waves CLA76, which is effectively emulating the same compressor. Moving on to the drum bus, you can see here that I have the vintage VCA, which is the SSL bus compressor, and I'm using this to compress the entirety of the drums on the drum subgroup. So there is a bit of a mismatch in levels. So the compressor, when it's on, makes the signal sound a little bit louder, but it also helps to glue in the entirety of the drums together, which is especially important in this mix because there are, again, no real live drums. These are all samples, so they really sound really disparate and separate from one another. So this glue compression right here on the drum subgroup with the vintage VCA is a great way of kind of gluing those things together. And finally, another way I like to use this compression is on guitars right here. You'll see that I have the vintage Opto emulating the Teletronics LA2A. I like this one because it's super fast and really helps to tame the dynamics of the guitars. So we can have a listen to that as well. Just makes their level more consistent and really makes them pop, especially when they are panned out to the sides of the mix right here. So one other thing I am using the compressor for in this mix is almost as a limiter, because I'm not really a big fan of the limiter in Logic. It's great for maximizing loudness, but not necessarily the loudness of any particular tracks. So I have a hat right here that I don't want to exceed a certain level, and the limiter wouldn't allow me to get down to that level. So I just put a compressor here with a very high ratio of 30:1, the maximum. And it's essentially acting as a limiter. I can also turn on this limiter and adjust this setting to achieve the same result. Just helping control that peak level. You saw that when I turned it off, it jumped up to -9, and before that, it was quite a bit lower. So that's pretty much it for compression. Again, a super powerful stock plugin that we have available to us in Logic Pro. Take full advantage, if you are using this, of all of these different algorithms and the emulations that they aim to recreate in plugin form. So moving on, next I have the enveloper, and I'm not using this on the mix, so we will just stay in this session for the enveloper or enveloper. Not exactly sure how you pronounce it. And right here, we effectively have a gain control for the attack and a gain control for the release. And those are the two primary parameters that I use this plugin for. And it's effectively a transient shaper. So right here on the kick drum, for example, we can start by looking at the kick, and then we will move to the hats later. I just wanted to accentuate the attack a little bit and give a little bit of extra sustain to the note right there. So if I play this kick back in solo, it just gives it a little bit more push and a little bit more forwardness. And if we listen to this in the context of the mix, it sounds like. So you can see how we can really take it a bit too far by going up to 100. I had it at 16, if I'm not mistaken. And it just helps push it a little bit further. It's very subtle, I know, but production is a lot about these subtleties in the mix to really help push things forward that need to be forward and to bring things back that need to be brought back. If we go to the hats and open up our automation, you can actually see that I'm automating the release gain of this enveloper plugin as well as the attack gain. So we can hear and see how this works in the mix. So it may seem a little haphazard, but you heard that when I turned this off, we just heard a steady, consistent sample being repeated. And so I wanted to give a little bit of livelihood to the hats in this mix. I may also go back and do a little bit of sidechain compression to give a little bit more rhythm. But in this case, I wanted to use the enveloper to give that same sort of effect of really playing a real hi-hat where there's different inflections and different velocities. So it's a great way to give a little bit of life to samples, especially if we're repeating the same sample over and over again. That's another great way. I love to use this envelope plugin right here, the stock one from Logic. So whether we want to lengthen notes or shorten them, we can adjust the gain to enhance or shorten in this enveloper plugin right here. And we can also enhance the attack or the transient energy of a sound, or conversely, soften the transients by bringing this way down. If I solo the kick again, and we have a listen to what it sounds like when the gain of the attack is all the way down, it will sound like this. So you can hear how we can really soften or harden the attack of any instrument that we want with this great stock plugin here in Logic. All right, moving on, we have one of my favorite plugins that comes stock with Logic, and that is the Channel EQ, which is a fully parametric EQ with the fast Fourier transform display here so that we can see what's going on. Now, I don't usually recommend mixing with our eyes, but it can sometimes be a good thing to actually see what's going on when we are looking for problem areas. But you see here that we have 8 bands. We have a high pass, low shelf, high shelf, and then 4 fully parametric bands right here. And you'll see that this is pretty much on every track throughout this mix, largely to do high pass filtering. Another great thing I love about the channel EQ is that it actually shows us the EQ curve right here. I should mention that the compressor as well will show us the gain reduction in a meter right here. So let's have a quick listen to that. So you can see this purple line shooting, that is the amount of gain reduction. So these are just valuable visual aspects that Logic automatically links to the first channel EQ in the case of this EQ graph, and the first compressor in the insert chain here in the case of this gain reduction meter. But moving back to channel EQ, we have a fantastic EQ that allows us to analyze the post or pre-frequency information. We can also process the left channel only, the right channel only, the mid channel only, or the side channel only. So we can use this as a full stereo EQ, or as a mid-side EQ, or as a left or right channel EQ if we wanted to. So a super powerful plugin. And what I usually use this for in mixing is just as a quick way to do some basic EQ moves. Now, I don't like mixing with my eyes, so I will often opt for something like the SSL channel by Waves to do the bulk of my EQ moves so that I'm really focusing on my ears. However, to quickly do some high passing, as you see here, a lot of tracks are high passed. That's a great use for the channel EQ, as well as doing some sweetening after the fact. Or if I ever need an extra band that is not included in the SSL, let's say I maxed out all, 5 bands of EQ in that plugin, and I needed an extra band, I could use the channel EQ there. It's also my go-to EQ on any of my effects returns. As you can see here, we have my effects returns, the parallel compression, snare plate, stereo delay, mono delay. You'll see in most of my mixes, I just have a simple channel EQ from Logic right here to really hone in and make those return channels really fit into the mix. This often means that I'm cutting a little bit in the lower mids to help clear up some of that mud and give more space for the important dry elements to really have that power in the low mid range. And if we switch over to the mixing session, you'll see that I do actually use the channel EQ quite significantly in the effects returns. All right, we are back in the mixing session, and you can see that right here, I have the channel EQ largely focused in the mid-range just to help clean up some of these effects returns to make them really sit well in the mix. If we go through all of these tracks, you can see, yeah, I have the SSL channel strip right here, and I'm using each of these bands right here. And so when I need an extra one, I just have the channel EQ to help bring out a little bit. In this case, the trombone, I brought out a little bit of that honkiness around 525 hertz that I wasn't getting from the SSL channel right here from Waves. So even though I'm using a lot of third-party plugins, I still use the channel EQ in nearly every one of my mixes, especially if there are small things that I need to tweak in revisions. I will just slap a simple channel EQ at the end of my insert chain right here and make these small adjustments to really hone in on what I'm trying to get done. All right, next up is the tape delay, which I am not using in this session. So let's quickly move back to the production session. All right, so as the name would suggest, the tape delay emulates a tape echo machine. Logic's not specific with which tape machine this delay actually emulates, but it does emulate the sound of tape delay, hence the name. So if I scroll over here, I have the tape delay in this session set up on my mono delay return. And this is just a simple plugin with a quarter note delay. We can sync this to the tempo, or we can go free right here with the delay time. Let's go back to a quarter note right here. Super easy to use. We have this character control, which we can choose between a clean or a diffuse tape head and adjust the clip threshold as well as the spread. We also have this EQ right here where we can adjust the low cut or high cut. Now we have a feedback control like any good delay plugin, which controls the amount of repeats that we have. And then we also have a modulation section down here where we can control the LFO rate and LFO intensity of the modulation, as well as the flutter rate and the flutter intensity. So this emulates the fact that tape machines weren't always at a consistent or constant speed. So a little bit of flutter would happen, which would alter the pitch slightly. So we have this entire section dedicated to that. Because this is an effects return, I have the dry all the way down, the wet 100% up, although you could, if you wanted to, insert this on a track itself and then adjust the dry wet control from there. So I use this plugin anytime I want to get tape delay. Although there are great third-party plugins, this is still a great option that is stock within Logic Pro. So let's hear what this sounds like in the mix. I'll play it back and I'll adjust the amount that this effects return is playing right here. Let's go find that synth that is driving that. We have this one right here. So it sounds good. The delays are being degraded with each successive repeat, and it's a great way to add a little bit of space to the mix and really anchor things in the mix. In this case, with this quarter note delay, that adds a little bit of feel and space to the mix without drawing attention to itself. Now we can also insert this tape delay directly on tracks. You can see that each of these pianos has the tape delay inserted directly on it. I typically wouldn't do this in a mix, but where this is a production session, I figured I would get a little bit creative with the pianos right here. So you see here that they have a quarter note delay. This piano 3 has a 16th note delay with different feedback controls and different EQs here on the character tab. So it just helps push those pianos a little bit back and just helps fill out that space in the more orchestral section at the beginning of this song. So tape delay is great as an insert directly on the track. It's great as a effects return to add a little bit of tape delay to our sessions, and it's free with Logic Pro as a stock plugin. One more thing I should mention about the tape delay plugin is that there's a neat little trick we can do. Let's take the guitars here, for example. And because we have this character tab right here, we can actually use the delay as a way to add tape saturation to our signals. So right here, we have a delay time of 0 milliseconds. I'll set the wet control all the way to 100, the feedback down to 0, and I'll adjust this clip threshold so that we get a bit of tape distortion or tape saturation on, in this case, the guitar bus right here. So let's loop this section and I will make these adjustments to give a little bit of saturation. Again, this is not what the tape delay plugin is designed for. It is a delay plugin after all. However, it's a good, neat little trick to use if you want a bit of tape saturation in Logic, because it's a pretty good emulation. So just a neat little trick to add a little bit of tape saturation if you'd like to use this plugin in that way. So that's typically how I use the tape plugin. There are different ways of using it. I didn't really show you too much of the modulation down here, but you can also add flutter and movement to the sound as well. Let's have a quick listen in the guitars. So you can hear that we can get pretty out of control with the flutter right here and the feedback, but that is what the tape delay plugin does right here. We can get into self-oscillation territory with feedback controls over 100%, but maybe that's a discussion for another video. I should mention that if you are finding this video useful thus far, I would invite you to hit that like button to help it spread to more people. I greatly appreciate that. All right, moving on, we have our stereo delay. Let me mute this tape delay. And the stereo delay is one of my favorites. It's super simple to use. I'll typically use this on my stereo delay effects return, and I typically have this set up for a delay time of 180 milliseconds on the left, 220 milliseconds on the right, regardless of the tempo of the song. Now, because this is an effects return, I have the left and right at 100%. I don't want any dry signal. And in this case, the feedback is all the way down, as is the crossfeed left to right. So typically you would have independent control over the feedback of the left delay versus the right delay. And you can also crossfeed this signal into the right delay or the right dry signal into the left. We can also alter the phase right here. It's a super powerful plugin. We have low cut and high cut for each of these channels, and we can route it in different ways as we are feeding it with a stereo signal. We also have tempo sync and stereo link here if we are so interested. So it's a super powerful plugin. I don't use it for all of its power. I will typically opt for third-party plugins if I really want to get tricky with the stereo delay, but it's a great plugin to just slap on and quickly get a stereo delay that helps add a little bit of width to the mix. So let's play this back, and I will drive this stereo delay up so you can hear its effect more obvious in the mix, and then I'll bring it back down so that we can hear how it just kind of fills out the stereo space. So it's just a great way to add a little bit of depth, a little bit of width and overall dimension to the mix by having this set up on the effects return right here. Sometimes I'll go through and use a stereo delay directly on a track. In this case, we can have a listen to this harp. So you see that I have some crossfeed happening right here, and I have a relatively fast delay, and I've got a little bit of deviation so that the exact times are a little bit off. So I have 30-second note dotted on each side with slight variances in deviation, which ultimately leads to a 66 millisecond delay on the left and a 69 millisecond delay on the right. And right here, I have the output mix so that we're getting 60% wet signal on the left and right, and that would make 39% dry signal on the left and right. One other technique I like to get out of the stereo delay plugin is the Haas effect. Now, I have a video going into detail about the Haas effect. I'll leave a link to that in the description box down below. But essentially, the Haas effect is when we have a single source and we delay that source with a delay time of about under 40 milliseconds. We will still perceive the source, original and delayed signal as a single sound. However, the direction of that sound will be in the direction of whatever sound hits our ear first. That may seem a little bit complicated, but if we were to open up a stereo delay under delay, we would turn that into stereo. So we have a mono track that we're turning stereo. And what we're going to do is turn the output all the way down on the left, all the way up on the right. And let's delay the right side by under 40 milliseconds. So let's choose an arbitrary number, 23 milliseconds on the right side. We'll turn down the feedback. And now when this is on, we will have effectively the Haas effect, which will really widen this bass. And then when we turn it off, the bass will be back down the center in mono. So let's have a listen to this. So you hear that it really widens it out across the stereo spectrum. That may not be the best example. How about we go over to the synth bass right here, solo that. So you heard that when it was bypassed, we heard it in mono. When we turned this delay on, we got that Haas effect, which really made the bass wide. And then you heard that as I brought this delay time up above 40 milliseconds, we actually started hearing it as two separate signals. So another really good use case of the stereo delay right here, and why I love using this plugin in my productions and my mixing in Logic Pro. All right, moving on to the next one, we have our Space Designer. And the Space Designer is Logic's stock convolution reverb. So you see here, I have it on my snare plate. If we open this up, I have the nice plate impulse response right here. So what a convolution reverb is a reverb where we input an impulse response, which is essentially a recording that was done in a physical location. And then that reverb through different algorithms will recreate the sound of that room on whatever signal we pass through it. So in this case, the emulation or the impulse response is of nice plate. This is a 2.3 second impulse response. although we can adjust the pre-delay length, size, crossover, low spread, high spread, dry, wet, among other things here on the plugin itself. So if we look at the different presets we can see we have large spaces, rooms, halls, plate reverbs, spring reverbs, indoor spaces, outdoor spaces, warped spaces in large, medium, small. We've got warped effects, which are special effects, surround spaces, HD surround spaces, and we can even bring in third-party impulse responses. So these 6 categories up here are all of the impulse responses that come stock with Logic, which is a tremendous amount. You can get a lot out of this plugin with just these. And then the BG Lexicon 480L is some third-party IRs that I loaded in. I'll leave a link in the description so that you can find these for yourself as well, and you'll be able to bring them into either Space Designer or whatever impulse response or convolution reverb you have in your DAW. So basically we can pick whatever room, hall, cathedral, plate, spring reverb we want, so long as we have an IR to create that. And so convolution reverbs are super powerful. The Space Designer is no different, and it comes free in stock with Logic Pro. So it is a go-to for me. I also have the Waves IR1, but typically I will use the stock one from Logic because it's a little bit easier on the resources, and I have a bunch of great IRs already in this one. So if I was to go ahead and solo the drums, we can hear the snare plate in Space Designer. So I'll toggle this on and off, bring it up in levels so that we can really hear it. So it really helps add that space to the drums without drawing too much attention to itself. Snare plate reverb is something I use in nearly every one of my mixes. I'll often opt for the Sound Toys little plate right here, but this video is not about Sound Toys, it's about Logic's stock plugin, so I really wanted to show you this convolution reverb right here. So in addition to the plate reverb we have right here, I also put it on my guitar verbs right here. If I go and solo those quickly, you'll see that guitar 3 is being bussed to bus 16, which is my guitar verb R, and then the guitar 4, which is panned to the right, is being sent to bus 15, which is my guitar verb L. And these are identical settings on the convolution reverb. If I open up the right one, you'll see that they are both 1.4 second amp spring. So these are both emulating the sound of spring reverb, which sounds great on guitar in my opinion. So I'll typically have these as an effects return in my mixes. So let's have a quick listen to that. Little bit of opposite side reverb to really fill out that space and give the guitars an almost ethereal feel on top of the mix. And the Space Designer convolution reverb is so powerful. I have it on the master reverb as well. In this case, I'm using the third-party Hall Medium Plus Stage. We can have a listen to what that sounds like real quick. Just really helps glue all of those orchestral elements together and making them sound like they are in fact on the same stage. I have this one cranked quite a bit just to really give that feel of them being in a space with a lot of reverb. So there's a ton that you can do with this plugin, and I will often reach for it in production and in mixing. To help save time in this video, I'm not going to jump over to the mix session just yet. Rather, I'm going to move on to Distortion 2, which is a distortion that emulates the distortion circuit of a Hammond B3 organ. Logic and Apple are very distinct on what this distortion is, and it's just a great little plugin to add a little bit of extra grit to drums, to bass, or whatever you'd like to add a little bit of grit to within the mix. So for example, if we have it on drums, I will solo the drum bus quickly. Can really add a little bit of grit and flavor to the drums. We see here that we have pre-gain control, drive control, and tone control. We have 5 different algorithms right here, including growl, bitey, nasty, class A, B soft, and class A, B hard. And another really cool thing about this plugin is that we have direct mix control, so we can do parallel saturation or parallel distortion on whatever we want by adjusting this mix. We also have our distortion output level so that we can better level match whether the plugin is on or off we will have the same perceived level of the signal. So you can hear that on the drums right there. I also have it on the synth bass if we want to listen to that. Just helps roll it off a little bit more as it is a bass at the end of the day. We can hear that it is on both of these guitars that we just listened to. Just adds a little bit of that harmonic coloration and gives it a bit more presence in the mix on the guitars. And we could go through a bunch of other tracks that I have a bit of distortion on. Typically, if I want some saturation, I'll reach for my go-to, which is the FabFilter Saturn II, which gives us a whole bunch of options. But again, we are looking at the stock plugins of Logic. So the Distortion 2 is usually my go-to distortion / saturation plugin, especially when I get dialed in the proper mix for a little bit of parallel processing when I'm inserting this on individual channels like I am doing in this mix. All right, next up is the direction mixer. This video is going on a little longer than I thought, so I'd like to thank you very much for sticking around. The direction mixer is essentially a stereo widening plugin. Now, I don't typically use stereo width plugins for increasing the width. Rather, I'll use it to narrow the width, and oftentimes in different sections of the song that I want wider or narrower, I will actually narrow a stereo source in these sections that need to be narrower, and then I'll actually just bring it back to its full stereo width at the wider sections. Very rarely will I actually go about panning something sort of beyond the limits with stereo widening plugins because I find they're a little bit unnatural, but I do really like the direction mixer. And let's have a look here, particularly at Synth 3. And what I have here is the split. I have that turned on. The crossover is at 220 hertz, so everything below 220 hertz will actually be brought in a little bit in terms of making it more mono. If this was standard, it would be at 1, and so by bringing it to 0.4, I'm making it more mono. And then at the high, I'm going against what I just said, but I'm actually making it more stereo with a spread of 1.36. So we can have a listen to what this sounds like. It's very subtle, but it just helps spread this synth a little bit further out in the mix. So you can hear how it's just right when I do these little touch-ups. When I had the spread all the way out, it really sounded unnatural and kind of phasey. And then when I brought it all the way in, you heard the phase cancellation that is inherent in the stereo signal as we are collapsing it to mono effectively. And you see over here that I have another directional mixer on the master verb where I'm again bringing in the low end. This time the crossover is at 200 hertz, just slightly, and I'm bringing out the direction of the high end. So the reverb of these instruments in the high end will be a little bit outside the stereo spectrum to really push things out, while the lower end is going to be brought in ever so slightly. And when I do push things out a little bit further, it's typically on effects returns where I can get away with a little bit of phasiness because I'm not necessarily concerned with mono compatibility in my stereo effects. However, it's a great way of getting that extra width in the overall context of the mix. And if I wanted certain tracks or subgroups or effects returns to be wider or narrower in different parts of the mix, I can always go about and automate the spread right here. So it's great for the long-term dynamics of the song. It's great for enhancing the stereo width or narrowing stereo tracks. And it's also great for mono compatibility, especially in the low end when we are bringing this in so that it's closer to a mono signal in the low end. All right, next up we have our Pedalboard, which is a super cool plugin. I don't really use this in mixing all that much, but we see here that we have a pedal board right here with a whole bunch of different pedals to choose from. Some of my favorites include the Wham right here, which is based on the Digitech Whammy. I can automate all the parameters on any of these plugins within the mix. I also really like the classic wah and the modern wah right there. I like the true delay right here, which emulates tape delay. I like the high drive up here, overdrive plugin, great for a little bit of distortion. I like the vibe, which is a chorus effect which is right here, which is the vibrato or chorus effect based on the scanner vibrato effect unit found in the Hammond B3 organ. So there's a whole bunch of different stuff we can choose from in the pedal board. I won't go through and demo everything, but this is a super powerful plugin, not only on guitar, which is typically what we think of when we think of a pedal board, but also on many other instruments in the mix. So right here on the Glock, I have the tape delay. If we listen back to this. That's a pretty cool effect, I think, to have on the Glock to just add a little bit more interest. You can see that I'm using the pedal board on a few other things within this mix, like the synth bass. Right here, I'm using the splitter to split up the frequencies. And then I'm sending the higher frequencies into this auto funk filter. And then I'm pressing a little bit of drive right here with the high drive treble booster before mixing things back in together. So the auto funk is not going to be affecting the low end. Rather, it's going to be envelope filtering the higher end. We can have a listen to this in the mix. Not level matched, I apologize for that, but there's a whole bunch of different cool stuff we can use this pedal for. Let me show you one more thing with the pedal board before moving on. We have this Synth 5, and we can turn things on and off, which we see here in the automation, the pedal state, which is in reference to the whammy pedal. So the whammy pedal is at a mix of about 8%. The tune is 12 semitones or an octave above the original. So we are mixing an octave above. At this point, that pedal gets turned on. And then if we look at the other automation going on, we have the pedal position of the wah going on right here. So if we have a listen to this, we can actually see these pedals reacting in real time. So pedal boards are not just something to run guitar signals through. They sound great on a whole bunch of different instruments, and they can really add interesting and unique effects to your productions and even your mixes. All right, so let's move on to plugin number 11 in my favorite stock Logic Pro plugins. And to do that, let's hop over to the mixing session once again. All right, we're back in the mixing session to talk about plugin number 11, and that is the De-Esser, the De-Esser 2 in particular, which can be found under Dynamics, De-Esser 2. And if you're mixing vocals, having a De-Esser is essential to really tame the sibilants and the hard consonants that are really piercing in the mix, especially when we are adding significant high end in the brilliance range, as you can see that I'm doing here with the SSL channel strip. So I'm adding about a 9 dB in a high shelf at about 12K, as well as significant energy at around 3.5K. And so these boosts, while they sound great to make the vocal pop and be more present and brilliant in the mix, they can also bring about harder sibilants and consonants that can really be piercing to the ears, which is where a De-Esser comes in. Now, the De-Esser is a fast-acting dynamics compressor designed to isolate and attenuate a particular band of high frequencies in a complex audio signal. So essentially, it's a compressor which will quickly reduce the gain of the sibilant frequencies, ideally as those sibilant frequencies come up in the mix. So anytime there's a hard S or a tss or ch, the De-Esser will clamp down on that sound only and bring it down in the mix to make the vocal less harsh overall. So obviously I use the De-Esser 2 stock Logic plugin for de-essing vocals. You can hear how I do that on this mix right here. I will solo the lead vocal right here to show you what it sounds like when it's on and off. Right here, I just usually opt for a preset. We have classic De-Esser female vocal split band, wide band, male vocal split band, wide band, mastering soothing, and mastering tame upper mids. So I have my threshold set to -8.9. So any signal that goes above this threshold in the defined frequency, which is defined as a high shelf at 8,774 hertz, will get reduced to a maximum reduction of 8 dB. We don't want to go too hard on our de-essing because it can make the vocalists sound like they have a lisp. However, we again don't want those sibilants to be piercing to the end listener. So let's have a listen with this De-Esser on, and then I'll turn it off and you can hear the difference.
Why do you take me in and then leave me on the ground? Why do you take me in?
So you hear on that take me in, that consonant in this case is very harsh, and so I tamed this down with the De-Esser.
Why do you take me in? Why do you take me in and
You saw the reduction go down there. We took about 6.8 dB down when that came in. And this will do this automatically throughout the mix, so you don't actually have to go in and duck an EQ in the sibilance range every time a sibilant peak comes about. So de-essing is super important. I use it when I'm mixing pretty much any vocal. In fact, I not only have the De-Esser here from Logic, but I also have Waves Sibilance, which is another great plugin that kind of takes care of sibilance automatically. So this is just kind of a failsafe after I do the bulk of the de-essing with this plugin right here. So where de-essing is a vital plugin to have, and the Distortion II is a fabulous de-esser in my opinion, it definitely makes my top 11 for Logic's stock plugins. All right, so those are my top 11 favorite stock plugins from Logic Pro and how I go about using them in my mixes and productions. And I use them very often in my mixes and production sessions. I'd also like to hear from you about what your favorite or go-to stock plugins are in Logic Pro. So leave a comment down below. I'd love to open up a dialogue about this. If you'd like to learn more about mixing in a practical way, you can hit that first link in the description box down below, sign up to my newsletter, and I will send you a free copy of my mixing guidebook, which goes through a solid workflow and the step-by-steps about getting through the start all the way to the end of a mix in the most efficient way possible. So if you're interested, that's the first link in the description box down below. And if you'd like to hang out with me more here on the YouTube channel, I would recommend hitting that subscribe button and checking out one of these videos up in the top or left right corner. So click on one of those, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.